25. The woman photographer invited Teresa to the magazine's cafeteria for a cup of coffee. "Those pictures of yours, they're very interesting. I couldn't help noticing what a terrific sense of the female body you have. You know what I mean, the girls with the provocative poses. The ones kissing passersby in front of the Russian tanks? Yes. You'd be a top-notch fashion photographer, you know. You have to get yourself a model first, someone like you who's looking for a break. Then you could make a portfolio of photographs and show them to the agencies. It would take us some time before you made a name for yourself naturally, but I can do one thing for you here and now. Introduce you to the editor in charge of our garden section. He might need some shots of cactuses and roses and things." "Thank you very much," Teresa said sincerely, because it was clear that the woman sitting opposite her was full of goodwill. But then she said to herself, why take pictures of cactuses? She had no desire to go through in Zurich what she'd been through in Prague, battles over job and career, over every picture published. She had never been ambitious out of vanity. All she had ever wanted was to escape from her mother's world. Yes, she saw it with absolute clarity. No matter how enthusiastic she was about taking pictures, she could just easily have turned her enthusiasm to any other endeavor. Photography was nothing but a way at getting at something higher and living beside Tomas. She said, "My husband is a doctor. He can support me. I don't need to take pictures." The one photographer replied, "I don't see how you can give it up after the beautiful work you've done." Yes, the pictures of the invasion were something else again. She had not done them for Tomas. She had done them out of passion, but not passion for photography. She had done them out of a passionate hatred. The situation would never recur, and these photographs, which she had made out of passion, were the ones that nobody wanted because they were out of date. Only cactuses had perennial appeal. The cactuses were of no interest to her. She said, "You're too kind, really, but I'd rather stay at home. I don't need a job." The woman said, "But will you be fulfilled sitting at home?" Teresa said, "More fulfilled than by taking pictures of cactuses." The woman said, "Even if you take pictures of cactuses, you're leading your life. If you live only for your husband, you have no life of your own." All of a sudden, Teresa felt annoyed. "My husband is my life, not cactuses." The woman photographer responded in kind, "You mean you think of yourself as happy?" Teresa, still annoyed, said, "Of course I'm happy." The woman said, "The only kind of woman who can say that is very—" She stopped short. Teresa finished for her. "Limited. That's what you mean, isn't it?" The woman regained control of herself and said, "Not limited. Anachronistic." "You're right," said Teresa wistfully. "That's just what my husband says about me." 26. Tomas spent days on end at the hospital, and she was at home alone. At least she had Karen and would take him on long walks. Home again, she would pore over her German and French grammars, but she felt sad and had trouble concentrating. She kept coming back to the speech Dubček had given her over the radio after his return from Moscow. Although she had completely forgotten what he said, she could still hear his quavering voice. She thought about how foreign soldiers had arrested him, had heard of independent state of his own country, held him for 4 days somewhere in the Ukrainian mountains, informed him he was to be executed, as a decade before they had executed his Hungarian counterpart, Imre Nagy, and then packed him off to Moscow, ordered him to have a bath and shave, to change his clothes and put on a tie, apprised him of the decision to commute his execution, instructed him to consider himself head of the state once more, sat him at a table opposite Brezhnev, forced him to act. He returned humiliated to address his humiliated nation. He was so humiliated he could not even speak. Teresa would never forget those awful pauses in the middle of his sentences. Was he that exhausted, ill, had they drugged him, or was it only despair? If nothing was to remain of Dubček, then at least those awful long pauses when he seemed unable to breathe, when he gasped for air before a whole nation glued to his radios. At least those pauses would remain. Those pauses contained all the horror that had befallen their country. It was the 7th day of the invasion. She heard the speech in the editorial offices of a newspaper that had been transformed overnight into an organ of the resistance. Everyone present hated Dubček at that moment. They reproached him for compromising. They felt humiliated by his humiliation. His weakness offended them. Thinking of Zurich of those days, she no longer felt any aversion to the man. The word weak no longer sounded like a verdict. Any man confronted with a superior strength is weak, even if he has an athletic body like Dubček's. The very weakness that at the time it seemed unbearable and repulsive, the weakness that had driven Teresa and Tomas from the country, suddenly attracted her. She realized that she belonged among the weak, in the camp of the weak, in the country of the weak, and that she had to be faithful to them precisely because they were weak and gasped for breath in the middle of sentences. She felt attracted by their weaknesses by vertigo. She felt attracted by it because she felt weak herself. Again she began to feel jealous, and again her hands shook. When Tomas noticed it, he did what he usually did. He took her hands in his and tried to calm them by pressing hard. She tore them away from him. "What's the matter?" he asked. "Nothing." "What do you want me to do for you?" "I want you to be old, 10 years older, 20 years older." What she meant was, "I want you to be weak as I am." 27. Karenin was not overjoyed by the move to Switzerland. Karenin hated change. Dog time cannot be plodded along a straight line. It does not move on and on from one thing to the next. It moves in a circle like the hands of a clock, which they too, unwilling to dash madly ahead, turn round and round to the face, day in and day out, following the same path. In Prague, when Tomas and Teresa bought a new chair and moved a flower pot, Karenin would look on in displeasure. It disturbed his sense of time. It was as though they were planning to dupe the hands of the clock by changing the numbers on its face. Nonetheless, he soon managed to re-establish the old order and the old rituals in the Zurich flat. As in Prague, he would jump up on their bed and welcome them to the day and accompany Teresa on her morning shopping jaunt to make certain he got the other walks coming to him as well. He was the timepiece of their lives. In periods of despair, she would remind herself she had to hold on because of him, because he was weaker than she, weaker perhaps even than Dubček in their abandoned homeland. One day, when they came back from a walk, the phone was ringing. She picked up the receiver and asked who it was. It was a woman's voice speaking German and asking for Tomas. It was an impatient voice, and Teresa felt like there was a hint of derision in it. When she said that Tomas wasn't there, she didn't know when he'd be back. The woman on the other end of the line started laughing, and without saying goodbye, hung up. Teresa knew it did not mean anything. It could have been a nurse from the hospital, a patient, a secretary, anyone. But still she was upset and unable to concentrate on anything. It was then that she realized she had lost the last bit of strength she had once had at home. She was absolutely incapable of tolerating his absolutely insignificant incident. Being in a foreign country meant walking on a tightrope high above the ground without the net afforded by a person by the country, where he has his family, colleagues, friends, and where he can easily say what he has to say in a language he has known from childhood. In Prague she was dependent on Tomas only when it came to the heart. Here she was dependent on him for everything. What would happen to her if he abandoned her? Would she have to live her whole life in fear of losing him? She told herself their acquaintance had been based on an error from the start. The copy of Anna Karenina put under her arm amounted to false papers. It had given Tomas the wrong idea. In spite of their love, they had made each other's life a hell. The fact that they loved each other was merely proof that the fault lay not in themselves, in their behavior or inconsistency of feeling, but rather than their incompatibility. He was strong and she was weak. She was like Dubček, who made a 30-second pause in the middle of a sentence. She was like her country, which stuttered, gasped for breath, could not speak. When the strong were too weak to hurt the weak had to be strong enough to leave. And having told herself all this, she pressed her face against Karenin's furry head and said, "Sorry, Karenin, it looks like you're going to have to move again." 28. Still crushed into a corner of the train compartment with her heavy suitcase above her head and Karenin squeezed against her legs, she kept thinking about the cook in the hotel restaurant where she had worked, where she lived with her mother. The cook took every opportunity to give her a slap on the behind, and never tried of asking her in front of everyone if she would give in and go to bed with him. It was odd that he was the one who came to mind. He had always been the prime example of everything she loathed. But now all she could think of was looking up to him and telling him, "You used to say you wanted to sleep with me. Well, here I am." She longed to do something that would prevent her from turning back to Tomas. She longed to destroy brutally the past 7 years of her life. It was vertigo, a heady, insuperable longing to fall. We might also call vertigo the intoxication of the weak. Aware of this weakness, a man decides to give in rather than stand up for it. He is weak with weakness. Drunk with weakness, wishes to grow even weaker, wishes to fall down in the middle of the main square, in front of everybody, wishes to be down, lower than down. She tried to talk herself into settling outside of Prague and giving up her profession as a photographer. She would go back to the small town from which Tomas's voice had once lured her. But once in Prague, she found that she had to spend more time taking care of various practical matters and began putting off her departure. On the 5th day, Tomas suddenly turned up. Karenin jumped all over him, and so it was a while before they had to make any overtures to each other. They felt like they were standing on a snow-covered plain, shivering with cold. Then they moved together like lovers who had never kissed before. "Has everything been all right?" he asked. "Yes," she answered. "Have you been to the magazine?" "I've given them a call." "Well, nothing yet. I've been waiting." "For what?" She made no response. She could not tell him that she had been waiting for him. 29. Now we return for a moment we already know about. Tomas was desperately unhappy and had a bad stomachache. He did not fall asleep until very late at night. Soon thereafter, Teresa awoke. There were Russian airplanes circling over Prague, and it was impossible to sleep for the noise. Her first thought was that he had come back because of her. Because of her, he had changed his destiny. Now he would no longer be responsible for her. Now she was responsible for him. The responsibility she felt seemed to require more strength than she could muster, but all at once she recalled that just before he had appeared at the door at the flat the day before, the church bells had chimed 6 o'clock. On the day they first met, her shift had ended at 6. She saw him sitting there in front of her, on the yellow bench, and heard the bells in the belfry chime 6. No, it was not superstition. It was a sense of beauty that cured her of her depression and imbued her with a new will to live. The birds of fortuity had alighted once more on her shoulders. There were tears in her eyes, and she was unutterably happy to hear him breathing at her side.